Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone had a great lunch. My name is Amber Rajas, and I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's session, well, the first session this afternoon. This session is focused on the International Council for Harmonization, ICH E21 guidelines. As many of us would have heard throughout the past couple of days, there are a lot of gaps in the field as it relates to maternal and pediatric clinical data. These guidelines seek to provide a framework for including pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials. So the session today is divided into two parts. The first one, we'll have two virtual presentations, and then in the second half, we'll have a panel discussion. So just before we get started, real quickly, let's get an idea of who is in the room and whether or not you have heard, whether or not you're familiar with these guidelines. So where are our trainees in the room? No? All right, we see some. Just by a show of hands, clinicians in the room? Any clinicians? All right. Okay. Academic professionals, academic researchers. Oh, those hands are straight. And then do we have anyone from government, industry? Government, all right, industry. Okay, so who all are familiar with these guidelines? Anyone? All right, that's less than 10 hands. So hopefully by the end of the session, more person will be familiar with them or be more motivated to become familiar with them. So our first session, or our first talk, will be by Dr. Leyla Sahin, who will be joining us virtually. She's the Deputy Director for Safety in the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health at the Federal Drug Administration, FDA. In her current role, she oversees pregnancy and lactation safety activities and leads various maternal health-related scientific and regulatory policy initiatives. Following her, we'll have Dr. Jocelyn Liu, who's the Senior Director in Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacometrics at Johnson & Johnson, where she supports the immunology team specifically for rheumatologic and autoantibody-related diseases for adults and pediatrics. So her slide's already up, and we're good to go. Dr. Sahin.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you all can hear me. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but thank you so much to the organizers of this session, to Sarah, Gary, and Christina for developing this session and for including me and for the opportunity to talk about ICH E21. So thanks so much. Next slide, please. This is a standard FDA disclaimer. I don't have any financial disclosures to report, and this presentation reflects the views, my personal views, and not the official position of the FDA. And also, I'm an OBGYN. I'm not a clinical pharmacologist. So just wanted to let you all know that. Next slide, please. So the objectives of my talk are to provide some background information on where the role of pregnant and breastfeeding women in drug development, the current status. I'm going to talk about some FDA guidances that we've published to try to advance this field. I'm going to talk about efforts both nationally and internationally to advance the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. And then I'm going to do kind of an overview of the ICH E21 draft guidance. Next slide, please. So in terms of background, why are we all here? We're here because there are approximately 3.6 million births that occur in the US every year. It's a significant part of the population. CDC just released the latest data. There's a slight decline in the fertility rate, but still in the range of 3.6 million births occurring every year. And we all know that pregnant and lactating women may need to be treated for chronic conditions or acute conditions. And unfortunately, pregnant and lactating women have historically been excluded from drug development trials, which is, the focus of our talk and this symposium today is, well, how do we move this field forward? And so the current state is that when new drugs are approved by the FDA, the only information related to use in pregnancy is animal reproductive toxicology data. I wanted to note that drugs that are approved for non-pregnant adults are also approved for use in pregnant and lactating women, unless specifically contraindicated. So I just want to make it clear that usage and prescribing for these populations is not considered an off-label usage. The other note that I wanted to make is that drugs are no longer labeled with a pregnancy letter category. So FDA implemented this new system, labeling system called the Pregnancy and Lactation Labeling Rule that has eliminated those letter categories. And so all of this to say that when new drugs are approved, that there's no data. And so what do we do about that? How do we get that data? Next slide, please. So in terms of the drug life cycle, most of the activities that we're currently seeing in these populations occurs in the post-marketing setting. And so what we're trying to do, what all stakeholders are trying to do or have an interest in doing, is try to get that data earlier. So rather than waiting, FDA did a review and was presented at a meeting at a public workshop in 2023 that showed that after new drugs are approved, it takes on the average 11 years to then add safety data to labeling. 11 years. So we can't really afford to wait 11 years anymore. So this is what we're all trying to do. We're trying to get the data earlier. Next slide, please. Are pregnant or lactating women being included in trials? So there was a publication in 2022 that looked at NIH-funded phase 3 and phase 4 trials that were listed in clinicaltrials.gov. And this review showed that NIH-funded trials, that of those trials, 69% excluded pregnant women and 50% excluded lactating women. So we had an interest in doing a similar kind of analysis, but looking at industry-funded trials. And so we looked between 2013 and 2023 at the same database at clinicaltrials.gov, and we found basically similar findings, that 67 to 70% of industry-funded trials excluded pregnant women, and 54 to 55% excluded lactating women. And this is just based on looking at the listing in clinicaltrials.gov that had exclusion criteria for these populations. So we didn't dive deeper. We didn't, get all the protocols and look specifically at the inclusion and exclusion criteria in the protocols. So the numbers may be even worse than this, because just because there may not have been an exclusion listed on clinicaltrials.gov doesn't necessarily mean that these populations were being included in the clinical trials. Next slide, please. The good news is that a paradigm shift is happening. There is increasing awareness and interest among all of our stakeholders on the need to include pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. So we're shifting that paradigm, and we're going, from that old paradigm of protecting pregnant women from research to the new paradigm of protecting women through research. And regulatory advances are occurring as well. The Common Rule has removed reference to pregnant women as a vulnerable population. So this came from stakeholders, because stakeholders felt that this was a very derogatory terminology, because pregnant women, have the capacity to provide consent as to whether or not they want to participate in a clinical trial. And currently, FDA is working to harmonize its own regulations with the Common Rule to also remove that use of that terminology, vulnerable population. Next slide, please. So among all of our stakeholders, we've had several discussions at several meetings where an issue that kept coming up was that there was a discussion that fear of liability was one of the main barriers to including pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. So based on that concern, NICHD funded this study that was conducted by the National Academies of Sciences, where they actually tried to assess whether whether liability is truly happening in these populations. And so they published their report in 2024, and the key findings actually showed that they didn't see any evidence of liability related to including pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. And so where most of the potential liability occurs is, once the drug gets approved and it's on the market, then of course there's mass prescribing, mass utilization without any information. And so this is when the liability occurs in the post-marketing setting. And so I guess a key message from this report is, well, the best way to prevent liability is to include these populations in clinical trials so that you can do it in a controlled fashion. Next slide, please. FDA has published several guidances related to these populations: lactation studies guidance, a guidance on the inclusion of pregnant women in clinical trials, and pharmacokinetics and pregnancy guidance. Next slide, please. So FDA is involved in a lot of different efforts to advance the conduct of clinical trials in these populations. Next slide, please. FDA was involved in this task force on research specific to pregnant women and lactating women. And I know a lot of others, especially on this panel, like I know Christina was involved, and I believe Sharon was involved as well. So this was a collaborative effort that included representatives across federal agencies, industry, academia, clinicians, professional organizations, patients, patient representatives. And for several years, this working group worked together to try to identify what are the knowledge gaps and then what can we do to address those knowledge gaps. And so 3 reports were published. There was one in 2018, 2020, and 2024. And I'm interested in hearing from others, maybe on this panel, who were previously involved. What's the next step? Is there funding to continue the work of PregLac? I'm interested to hear that. Next slide, please. So these are some of the recommendations relevant, to this topic today that came out of PregLac. And so, PregLac was instrumental in really advancing this field, and also in terms of leading to the development of the ICH E21 guidance. So a lot of these recommendations that are here that came out of PregLac were implemented, and included in the ICH E21 guidelines. So, there's a need to increase the quantity, quality, and timeliness of research involving products used by these populations. We need to implement, sponsors need to implement a proactive approach to protocol development and study design, and that, it should no longer be the default of exclusion of these populations. And if they're going to be excluded, then that should be justified. There needs to be, sponsors need to develop a systematic plan for timely collection of these data. And then IRBs, we should provide IRBs with recommended practices so that they can understand the issues, so that they can be involved in reviewing protocols and understanding all the nuances involved in doing this type of clinical research. Next slide, please. FDA is also involved internationally to advance this field. And so on a regular basis, FDA meets with other regulatory agencies like Health Canada, EMA, and MHRA to discuss all these scientific and regulatory issues. Next slide, please. And so FDA has been involved as part of this global collaboration with other regulatory agencies around the world and with industry representatives. We've been involved in this working group that led to the writing and the development and the publication of this draft guidance, ICH E21, that was published last summer by FDA. So after it was published, there was a public comment period, and currently the working group, the expert working group, is meeting on a regular basis to review those comments and to try to address them and work on revising the guidance so that it can be published as a final guidance. And so this today is a great opportunity for all of you to provide any suggestions or recommendations that you have to try to improve this guidance, because right in the end it's going to impact everybody around the world. Next slide, please. And so the goal, of course, of this guidance is to provide a globally accepted framework to allow the inclusion or retention of pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials. And the guidance, right now, it is kind of high level, but it does cover, the basic principles to allow the collection of safety, efficacy, PK data in pregnant and breastfeeding women to better inform clinical care. And, of course, from a regulatory perspective, to improve product labeling. Next slide, please. So the key principles of this guidance is that inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials should really be considered for all products where they're going to be used by these populations. It's also, of course, especially important for conditions where there's a high unmet medical need. However, the scope of the guidance is not limited to these scenarios. And this is important because, we have received input on the FDA guidance on clinical trials in pregnant women, where we were told that the scope of that guidance is very limited, because it makes it sound like, the only time you should include pregnant women in clinical trials is like for a serious or life-threatening condition. And so that's not the intent at all. So sponsors need to be involved in proactive planning to obtain the data. So whether it's non-clinical data or clinical data, or, they should provide a rationale for not obtaining that data. So this should all be done from the early stages of, the clinical development program for their investigational product. Next slide, please. So in terms of the development strategy, sponsors should anticipate that, the approach to include pregnant women in clinical trials is going to require careful assessment of benefits and risks. And, this assessment may evolve during development depending on multiple factors. So, depending on where you are in terms of clinical development, the duration of the treatment, the indication that's being sought, and the strength of whatever available evidence you have at one particular time in development. And then the approach may be different depending on, when during pregnancy you're planning to administer the study drug. So is it like early in pregnancy, where of course there's huge concern for organogenesis, or is it something that's going to be administered later, close to delivery? So lots of considerations. Next slide, please. So in terms of the evidence that's needed to support inclusion in clinical trials, so this depends on a weight of evidence approach and consideration of all these factors. So again, the indication, the intended population, the availability of your non-clinical data. Have the DART studies been conducted? Is there a prospect of benefit? How much data do you have to support that prospect of benefit? The clinical pharmacology of the investigational product. Is there biological plausibility of harm during pregnancy? And then when in pregnancy will the study drug be administered? And then a novelty of the investigational product. So is this a new moiety where we really don't have much information. And so that's going to be much more complicated to try to get, you know, safety data, efficacy data, or whatever, you know, preliminary mechanism of action data. Whereas, you know, is it a product where there's already approved products that have a similar mechanism of action, et cetera. So it's going to be, it's really going to impact how much data you're going to need to collect. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the non-clinical data, you know, that are needed before you can proceed to including pregnant women in clinical trials. So, you know, these may involve the standard DART studies, standard genotoxicity studies, appropriately qualified or validated, you know, alternative methods, any relevant modeling. And then just to note that the timing and the need for DART studies, again, you know, it's not kind of one size fits all, right? It really is impacted by the characteristics of your product, the clinical indication, the intended patient population, et cetera. And then if risks are identified at some point during the clinical development program, then additional investigations may be needed. Next slide, please. So the benefit risk assessment is really an iterative process that occurs throughout drug development. And so as, you know, things evolve during development and as more data are collected, then, you know, at some point, you know, sponsors should determine, you know, when there is adequate data to support a favorable benefit risk assessment to then proceed with allowing pregnant women to participate. And so at, you know, maybe earlier in development, it might not be reasonable, right? You might not have your DART studies, or you might not have enough data that support a prospect of benefit. And so, but as your program continues, then, you know, sponsors should then continue to try to, you know, continually reassess and try to get further data to see, you know, at what point is it going to be permissible to then allow pregnant women to participate in their clinical trials. Or, you know, is there a strong rationale for not including these populations? You know, for some products, the benefits of use in pregnancy might still outweigh the potential risks. So, for example, if it's a serious or life-threatening condition, there's no available treatments, you know, then it might still be permissible to allow pregnant women to participate. Next slide, please. So once the favorable benefit risk assessment is achieved, then there needs to be consideration of the following. So how do you recruit pregnant women into the trials? You know, can you then proceed with removing the contraception requirements? Can you allow women who get pregnant during a trial to continue? And then, you know, is there a need for specific separate studies that only include pregnant women? Next slide, please. So in terms of study design considerations, the key elements, you know, the expertise that's needed, you know, definitely need to consult obstetricians, maternal fetal medicine specialists, considerations for sample size, consider the expected enrollment and withdrawal rates, PK and dosing information. So it's important to assess across trimesters and postpartum to see if there's a need for dose adjustments during pregnancy. In general, the endpoints, you know, the efficacy endpoints are the same as the general population. Plus, in addition to that, of course, you need your pregnancy-specific outcomes. You need to do close monitoring in pregnancy with appropriate, you know, management plans or stopping criteria. And then the follow-up, you know, you're going to need to follow up the infant that was exposed during pregnancy, so that is going to probably extend along, you know, beyond the trial completion. And you may need to then enroll, that woman into a post-approval pregnancy safety study, like a pregnancy registry, et cetera, to follow the infant. Next slide, please. So when it comes to breastfeeding, it's very similar in terms of, similar to pregnancy in that it is an iterative process. So again, the benefit risk considerations are constantly evolving as you progress in your clinical development program and get more data. I guess the only difference, right, is that for breastfeeding, there is an option to avoid exposure. So you can replace, right, you can replace the breast milk with formula. And so sponsors need to consider, okay, so along their development program, when are they going to have enough data where it would be allowable to expose a breastfed child to the product, and if and when it will be allowable to then include breastfeeding women in their trials. Next slide, please. So the benefit risk assessment involves multiple factors, such as, how much of the product passes into the breast milk, how much is absorbed by the breastfed child, are there available treatment alternatives, the benefits of breastfeeding, and then alternatives to breastfeeding. So the guidance discusses, the need to obtain information on the transfer of the product into breast milk, and then subsequently inclusion of breastfeeding women in clinical trials after your product has been, well characterized related to breastfeeding. Next slide, please. In terms of the non-clinical data that may be used to generate data on lactation exposure to a product, so the standard PP&D studies, juvenile toxicology studies, qualified, validated alternative assays may be helpful. Appropriate use of modeling techniques such as PBPK modeling. All of these methods may help generate lactation data. Next slide, please. So in terms of data collection for breastfeeding, we can think about this broadly in terms of like stepwise approach. So one, determining the concentration of the product in breast milk relative to the maternal therapeutic blood levels, and then using the breast milk concentration data to estimate the daily infant dose and relative infant dose, and then collecting infant exposure data, safety data, and benefit data if that applies. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the end of the talk. So in summary, FDA and all of you here, at this meeting and on this panel, everybody is, highly committed to advance inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials. This, ICH E21, it's a new draft guidance, and, it's kind of a first step in providing a kind of globally accepted framework to allow inclusion of these populations in clinical trials. And, from the FDA perspective, as a regulator, we recommend initiating early discussions with the FDA related to, development plans for including these populations in clinical trials. Next slide, please. And I think that's the end. So thank you very much for your attention. The references are at the end of the slide deck. Yeah, thanks so much.